The Kira case is perhaps the most complex criminal investigation in the history of fiction. Light Yagami and L both have super genius level intellect, so the Cold War between the two was not only peak television, but also led to an absolute mental maze of a hunt for the real Kira. But today, I'm going to insert perhaps the most infamous serial killer hunter into this already great equation. What would happen if Dexter Morgan was also in pursuit of Kira? Would Dexter be able to find proof of Light being Kira? Would he be able to catch Light off guard and put him on his table? Or would Light Yagami just always prove to be one step ahead and end up writing Dexter's name in his notebook of death? Just to lay a few things out before beginning my analysis, I know Dexter's birth name was technically Dexter Moser, but the death note operates with a person's legal name, and since Dexter has identified as a Morgan for most of his life, he will die if Light writes Dexter Morgan in the death note. Light won't have to do extra research to find his birth name. And as for the scenario that I'll be crafting to pit these two legendary serial killers against one another, I'll be changing the setting of Death Note to Miami. So rather than the Japanese police force, Miami Metro will be on the job. I'll also be replacing Captain Matthews with Mr. Yagami, Light's father, since his dad being on the force is a major component of the story. And of course, L will still be the head of the Kira investigation once it gets underway. Given that this means there's no more Ray Penber in my scenario, I'm going to have a Miami Metro detective tailing Light Yagami instead, and this detective's name is Deborah Morgan. So rather than Light manipulating and ultimately killing Ray Penber, Deborah will suffer this fate. So essentially, Dexter Morgan is going to be placed in the role of Ray Penber's fiancé. The death of Deb would motivate Dexter to pursue the Kira killer and want to bring Kira to justice by putting him on Dexter's table. Now, I'm pretty confident that Dexter could make similar deductions as Ray's fiancé made, so I do think Dexter would be able to narrow down his search to the people that Deb was tailing. And since he works alone, he wouldn't try to bring his theories to the rest of his Miami Metro team. And this brings us to our first interesting point of discussion. Because I think Dexter would sneak into Light's house to inspect his room, as he's done with numerous serial killers that he's been investigating in the past, since he operates on needing 100% proof that the people he places on his table truly deserve it. And when Dexter gets into Light Yagami's room, I think he would possibly trigger the fire trap that Light made in his desk. This would mean that the death note would end up getting burned. Dexter has experience escaping fires thanks to Lila in Season 2, so I'm confident he could escape the room, but he would be left in a position where he has no hard proof. But given the fact that this trap was set up in Light's room in the first place, I think Dexter is smart enough to know that means Light was hiding something. And I think Dexter would be about 75% sure that Light is Kira at this point. So here would be Dexter's first and maybe best chance at victory. I think there's a small chance that Dexter might be able to catch Light off guard in the chaos of his house being burned down. Maybe inject him with some M99, put him on his table, and take him out. But this would only happen if Dexter was willing to bend his code. Essentially, his emotions surrounding Deb's death would need to bring him to the point where he's willing to ignore the aspect of his code that requires 100% hard proof, which I don't think is impossible. We saw Dexter kill a random dude following Rita's death, and he killed Saxon on camera in cold blood after Deb's actual canonical death. In that moment, he simply did not care about the consequences of his actions. So I think it's fair to argue that Dexter might take the fire booby trap as enough proof to go ahead and try to kill Light. Ultimately, this is probably Dexter's best chance at getting Light on his table, but even if we do assume he'd be willing to bend his code in this moment, there's no guarantee that he'd be able to catch Light off guard. Light is much smarter than Dexter, and he'd be naturally on edge after his room burning up. And there's the issue that Light's room was full of surveillance cameras for a while, so there's a pretty good chance that Dexter would have been caught on camera searching Light's room illegally. So I think the most likely next step of my story would see Elle and crew arresting and interrogating Dexter. They'd want to know why he was searching Light's room and how this fire started. And Dexter has a bit of a history of being caught on camera. We saw it in Season 2 with the cameras that Lundy set up at the harbor, and with Stan Liddy in Season 5. So Dexter, in my opinion, likely ends up in a similar position to Misa, where he is brought in for questioning by L. You might think this would be horrible for Dexter's chances of catching Light, but it might not be. If L could manage to arrest Dexter before Light learns of who broke into his room, I think L would interrogate Dexter, maybe learn of why Dexter was searching Light's room, and they'd potentially compare notes. In this scenario, they'd probably jointly come to the conclusion that Light is most likely Kira. And with the death note being burned in this scenario, unless Light had multiple pages ripped out of the book in advance, Light would be unable to continue killing criminals, which would mean that immediately following the destruction of Light's room, the killings would cease. And it wouldn't take a genius to realize that means the tool responsible for all these killings was in Light's room. Now, this isn't enough evidence for L to convict Light necessarily, but I think it would be enough for Dexter, especially in an emotional state following his sister's death, to decide to kill Light. So in this scenario I've laid out, assuming L is in the picture, I think Dexter could actually catch and kill Light Yagami. However, I do think everything would have to go perfectly for Dexter in order to achieve this result. So I'd give it about a 5 to 15% chance of going down like this, ending with Dexter plunging his knife into Light Yagami's chest. The reason I think it's so low is because there's actually a decent chance Dexter wouldn't trigger the booby trap in Light's room at all, which would mean he wouldn't have any evidence of Light's guilt. And if he attempted to tail Light afterwards, Light would have Ryuk to alert him of Dexter's presence. And I think given Light's much higher intellect, he'd be able to eventually piece together who Dexter is. And once he has his name, it's game over. There's also a strong possibility that L would realize that Dexter himself is a serial killer, and maybe suspect Dexter of being Kira. I mean, Dexter is someone who has a somewhat similar mindset to Kira, so Dexter being in the picture might actually give Light reasonable doubt to help prove his innocence. So yeah, I think Dexter trying to solve the Kira case would be very messy. There's not a 0% chance that he could get Light on his table, and I think I've laid out his potential paths to victory. But given all the variables at play, and the fact that he'd be dealing with two people with a much higher intellect than his own, which is a very unnatural position for Dexter to find himself in, I think Dexter more than likely would be in over his head. If Special Agent Lundy, who I think we can all agree is not nearly as smart as L, was arguably onto Dexter and thought he was suspicious, then I think L might honestly be a bigger obstacle to overcome for Dexter than Light. In a way, he'd not only be trying to catch Light, he'd also be trying to get L off of his scent. Essentially, it'd be like Dexter trying to catch a much smarter Trinity killer, all while having a much smarter Dokes onto him trying to prove that Dexter is a killer. Now, you might have clicked on this video hoping for an analysis of what would happen if Dexter was placed in L's position as a detective trying to solve the Kira case, but I personally think that isn't nearly as interesting because Dexter is just not as smart as L. He's not even close, to be frank, so he just flat out loses 10 times out of 10 in that position. But in the scenario I've laid out, with both L and Light in play, the Bay Harbor Butcher would have a shot to break the Kira case. Not a particularly high chance at victory, but it is a pathway to victory nonetheless. Well, if you made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this all. Do you think Dexter Morgan could solve the Kira case and catch Light Yagami? Or do you think he'd just become another name written on its deadly pages? I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more Screen Stories content. I'll have some of my other Death Note and Dexter themed videos linked in the description, so you might just find something else you like. Thank you for watching, and until next time, peace.